Last time we spoke about the establishment of the Jiangxi Soviet. After the CCP's failed uprisings, Mao Zedong and Zhe De fled to rural China, determined to build a strong, agrarian-based Red Army. Mao Zedong narrowly escaped capture and regrouped with fewer than 1,000 soldiers, facing morale and loyalty issues. To rebuild, he implemented reforms, creating political structures within the army to strengthen revolutionary spirit and establish troop Soviets for democratic centralism. Seeking refuge, Mao Zedong negotiated with local bandit leaders Yuan Wencai and Wang Zhou to secure Jinggangshan, a defensible mountain area. The Red Army began guerrilla operations, seizing nearby villages and towns, rapidly expanding the territory. Over time, despite facing encirclement campaigns by nationalist forces, Mao Zedong's Red Army persevered, using flexible tactics, alliances, and propaganda. This period laid the groundwork for the growth of the Jiangxi Soviet, where the Red Army united diverse groups and adapted communist policies to local conditions, eventually strengthening their movement for future battle. This episode is the first encirclement campaign. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia. Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more, so give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. I have a huge favor to ask. I recently opened up a YouTube membership, which is identical to my Patreon account, found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast, with about 25 plus episodes and ongoing, early access to all of the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. This month's exclusive episode is actually kind of special for you guys for this podcast. It's about how the Century of Humiliation, the very subject of this entire podcast, and how it formed the People's Republic of China we see today. I cover the entire history of the Century of Humiliation, and then I look at Cold War China and current modern-day China. There's actually a lot of geopolitics involved. Now, as anyone knows, it's hard to start from scratch, and the YouTube membership is slow to build up, but I would love to build more of a presence there. Now, for you podcast lovers, if you decide to join the YouTube membership, it comes with a bit of a bonus. Over the years, I've had a lot of content that I just never released to the public, for numerous reasons. A lot of politically incorrect reasons, to be honest. So if you go over to the YouTube membership and you join up, over there, you're going to get a lot of bonus episodes. Stating all of that, let's just get into it. We last left off with the establishment of the Jiangxi Soviet and the expansion into Fujian province. In spite of the continuous attacks by provincial and NRA forces, the communist movement was flourishing in the countryside. After the multiple failed uprisings in 1927, support for urban insurrection as the cornerstone of the revolution was fragmented. Likewise, the KMT unleashed anti-communist campaigns inside major cities, cracking down on communist activities, driving them underground. The urban labor unions were also not very receptive to communist propaganda. A lack of enthusiasm for communism was evident in the early party demographics. In 1928, peasants made up 3/4 of the CCP membership, while Shanghai labor union members dropped from 3,000 to 700 by 1930. In the face of these statistics, the CCP continued to look at the urban centers as the key to a communist revolution. It was an issue of philosophy. The Central Committee maintained an unwavering belief that the proletariat should carry out urban uprisings as a means of inciting the Grand Revolution. As the head of the CCP propaganda department, Li Lisan was one of the largest proponents for the urban insurrection model. Li Lisan had returned to China from France in 1928, and he argued the proletariat was still very much the center of the movement, and that, quote, "The peasantry is petty bourgeois and cannot have correct ideas regarding socialism. Only the proletariat mentality can lead us onto the correct revolutionary road." Li Lisan pushed for the occupation of large cities rather than expanding the rural Soviets. However, his attempts to reinvigorate the labor movements in urban centers was not going very well. In 1929, Joseph Stalin came under the belief the communist revolution in China was starting to heat up, citing the economic depression because of the market crash of 1929 as evidence. He had the Comintern begin publishing a series of guidances and measures in February and June of 1929 that re-emphasized urban insurrection. In September, the Comintern pushed for the CCP to leverage labor unions as a means of delivering the revolution to the masses. In October, the Comintern estimated that a crescendo was met and that the revolutionary upsurge was well on its way. Yet the Comintern did not know when the revolution would begin, and its subsequent guidance became incoherent to the CCP. Regardless, the CCP took the guidance and prepared to start a revolution. By 1930, the Red Army remained the only force able to lead urban uprisings. Urban labor movements were still not complying, thus Li Lisan was forced to depend on the Red Army. He planned to gain control over the Red Army by establishing central party control over it, dividing the forces away from its leaders. In April of 1930, the Central Committee issued 2 resolutions for the creation of a General Front Committee to lead urban uprisings. Li Lisan also requested Mao Zedong and Zhou De travel to Shanghai to separate them from their troops. Neither would end up coming to Shanghai, however. In 1930, the CCP began promoting the Comintern's October Directive, reaffirming that all conditions were ripe for revolution, despite the urban labor realities. In February, the Conference of Delegates from the Soviet areas repudiated Mao Zedong's strategies of encircling cities in favor of urban insurrection. To this, the Central Committee chastised Mao Zedong and Zhou De's forces for having what they termed a hide and disperse view, and instead pushed for the Red Army to concentrate and attack. Clearly, the Li Lisan plan was to counter Mao Zedong's. Mao Zedong was promoting slow expansion, focusing on land distribution and establishing Soviets, rather than a full frontal attack and the seizure of a city like Changsha. Mao Zedong foresaw a slow bottom-up model. Recruits would start as local village militia, become Red Guards, join the Red Army forces, and then main Red Army units. Li Lisan saw this as defeatist and wanted to concentrate weapons instead of dividing them equally amongst the local militias, the Red Guards, and other guerrilla units. Li Lisan also complained to his colleagues Mao Zedong's strategy was slow, and he famously said, "By such tactics, our hair will be white before the revolution is victorious." By 1930, the CCP focused on 2 provinces to ignite its revolution. A series of uprisings would be unleashed in Nanchang, Changsha, and Wuhan. It was believed if Wuhan fell, the revolution would spread to Shanghai, setting off a worldwide chain of revolutionary events. Things were not looking good for uprisings in cities, however. From 1926 to 1930, the working class membership of the CCP had dropped 66% to just 8%. The Red Army, despite growing, suffered from a lack of equipment and training. Mao Zedong and Zhou De had their misgivings about the uprisings, but they were something of a minority, and they had to comply. On June the 22nd, they both issued orders to conduct attacks. The 1st Red Army Corps, formed from the 4th Red Army, was to attack Nanchang, while the 3rd Red Army Corps, formed from Peng Dehua's 5th Red Army, would attack Changsha. Yet against the wishes of Li Lisan, Mao Zedong left 3 army units back at the Jiangxi Soviet to defend the area. The 3rd Red Army Corps was the first to attack, capturing Changsha on July the 29th. Peng Dehuai quickly established a Soviet government, with Li Lisan acting as its chairman. However, the arrival of Red soldiers did not elicit an urban uprising. On July the 30th, British, American, Italian, and Japanese ships sailed up the Xiang River to defend their concessions and their citizens. Naval bombardment, coupled with a lack of urban support, dislodged Peng Dehuai's men from the city by August the 3rd. They did, however, grab as much money and supplies as they could on their way out. After their withdrawal, the NRA occupied the city and began purging all the communist sympathizers that they could find. The 1st Red Army Corps did not do much better. Mao Zedong and Zhou De's men attacked Nanchang, but initially dispatched reconnaissance forces into the city on August the 1st. It was quickly determined that little progress could be made, so the forces moved to Luoyang and Hunan. At Luoyang, the 1st and 3rd Red Armies consolidated their forces into the 1st Front Red Army and planned their next move. The assessment of Changsha and Wuhan was quite grim. NRA forces had recently begun reinforcing the 2 cities, while also establishing a defense in depth. Foreign naval ships were stationed along the Yangtze River, providing fire support. Mao Zedong and Zhou De both argued against it, but reluctantly had to agree to attack Changsha on September the 1st. The second attack against Changsha was a complete and utter disaster. The better-equipped enemy, within strong defensive positions, tossed the Red Army on its ass. After 10 days of fighting and facing severe losses, Mao Zedong and Zhou De made a bold move. They ordered a withdrawal on the 13th, stating that Li Lisan was wrong and a change of plan was required. This caused a deep divide in the Red Army, with many political commissars objecting to the order. But the Red soldiers complied and conducted an orderly withdrawal. Now there emerged a faction in the CCP backed by Li Lisan calling for another attack against Nanchang. Mao Zedong and Zhou De believed it was impossible as the NRA held an even stronger position at Nanchang. Thus Mao Zedong came up with a compromise. What if they attacked Jing'an, a strategic city centered on the Jiangxi Soviet? If it was captured, the southwestern portion of the Jiangxi Soviet would be joined together to greatly expand the Soviet area. On the morning of October the 4th, the Red Army with local militias advanced into Jian from 3 directions, and by nightfall they captured the city. This was facilitated by a large influx of peasantry support for the Red Army. Some claim over 1 million peasants marched upon the city to support the Reds. They also covertly raided the KMT HQ in Jian, where they discovered documents about an upcoming NRA encirclement campaign. With this discovery, the Li Lisan strategy ended, as the CCP now needed to secure their own survival. Li Lisan's epic failure released a cascade of internal power grabs that influenced the political and military direction going forward. After the second failure at Changsha, Mao Zedong began publicly attacking Li Lisan to increase his own standing. Within the Red Army, 2 diverging viewpoints emerged, that of Mao Zedong's rural encirclement strategy and Li Lisan's urban uprising strategy. Political commissars labeled Mao Zedong as treacherous for attacking Li Lisan, while the peasantry troops all agreed with Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was also confronted with another issue. The Jiangxi Provincial Action Committee was also looking for a power grab. They were a newly formed committee who were vying for control over the Red Army. Mao Zedong was currently performing a survey over the rural area of Jingguo, and while doing so, he suddenly identified suspicious linkages between the KMT-funded anti-Bolshevik Corps, aka the AB Group, who had undercover agents charged with sabotaging communist units, and the local Jiangxi Action Committee and the 20th Red Army leaders such as Li Wanlin. Armed with this evidence, Mao Zedong unleashed a huge purge of the Red Army. In November, he arrested 4,000 members of the 20th Red Army, including all but 2 members of the Jiangxi Provincial Action Committee, all of whom were charged with treason. The purge effectively negated his little problem, and what a coincidence. But it would cause him some headaches. The following month, a battalion of the 20th Red Army, led by Luo Zizao, captured Fujian, and there they released 40 recently purged comrades who were suspected to have ties to the AB Corps. The men released them and took them across the Gan River to establish a new Soviet in Yongyang. From the Soviet, the accused men looked to clear their names and appealed to the Central Committee, as well as Zhu De and Peng Duai. The 20th Red Army argued they were wrongfully accused of being AB Corps members. It was their argument that Mao Zedong accused them because they had criticized him. A large group of the 20th Red Army left the Soviet apparently to perform peace talks in July of 1931, but they would be arrested, put on trial, and executed. This all became known as the Fujian Incident. Though quite slanderous, it did not pick up a lot of steam at the time, mostly because the Comintern and the Central Committee were too busy condemning Li Lisan for his failures. Zhou Enlai was sent back to Russia to try and clean up the embarrassing Changsha debacle. When he arrived, he distanced himself from the party and from Li Lisan, and this effectively handed the congruence to Mao Zedong's strategy, further helping him consolidate his power. Added to this, the Comintern sent a letter to the CCP in November of 1930, stating Li Lisan's ideas were inconsistent with the Comintern's guidance and antagonistic to the greater communist cause. Li Lisan was recalled to Moscow, where he tried to save his own ass. In the meantime, the CCP's leadership had a difficult time regaining traction until late 1931. Now, going back to the documents that were found, speaking about an encirclement campaign, the NRA dispatched a large force to deal with the Reds. It consisted of the 9th Red Army, led by Governor of Jiangxi, Lu Zuping, the 6th Red Army from Hunan, led by Zhu Shaoling, and the 19th Red Army, led by Jiang Guangnai. Altogether, they were about 44,000 men strong, divided into 5 divisions and 3 air bombing corps. The plan was to encircle the Jiangxi Soviets, pressing them back into the mountains. Once fully encircled, the NRA would then attack Donggu, Longgang, and Dongshao. After the capture of Jian, the Red Army leadership alongside the Jiangxi Action Committee held a conference at Liufang on October the 25th to figure out how to respond to the incoming encirclement campaign. Many called for re-attacking Nanchang or Zhejiang to try and divert the NRA forces away from the Jiangxi Soviet. Mao Zedong argued instead to perform his classic lure the enemy in deep strategy. Essentially, Mao Zedong wanted to trade land for time. Initially, the Red Army would evacuate the western areas of the Gan River and head east to mobilize the local people, raise funds, and recruit. The eastwards movement would also lure the NRA across the river into the Red Army terrain, overstretching their logistical lines. This way, the Reds could choose where to face the enemy and hopefully divide and conquer them. It was Mao Zedong's belief the only feasible way to defeat the NRA was to lure them in and then attack places like Nanchang and Zhejiang, where they were depleted of defenders. On November the 1st, the Red Army began advancing across the Gan River into Jian, Jishui, Xingan, Lian, Yongfang, Yihuang, Zhongren, and Nanfang counties. Within 6 days, the Red Army had seized 400,000 yuan and enlisted the support of local populaces. During this time, members of the 3rd Red Army Corps rebelled against Mao Zedong's strategy, arguing instead to occupy the western Gan River area. Peng Dehuai was able to suppress the dissension, and by mid-November, the entire Red Army was occupying the eastern bank of the Gan River. The NRA followed the Reds across the Gan River. By November the 18th, the NRA was advancing in 3 columns. The first occupied Yongfang and Jishui, the second occupied Lian, Yihuang, and the third occupied Jian. As the NRA continued to advance, they had limited engagements against the Reds. By the 26th, the Reds were now occupying Donggu, Nanlong, and Longgang. Things were all going according to plan, but then the Futian incident hit on December the 7th. The mutiny jeopardized the Red Army's western flank, forcing them to abandon Donggu and the Futian area by December the 15th. The remainder of the 3rd Red Army Corps advanced into the northern area of the Ningbo County and then occupied Pingtian and Anfu. NRA intelligence began figuring out that there was internal strife amongst the Reds, and they wanted to exploit it. On the 16th, Lu Zuping ordered 2 divisions to encircle and attack Donggu. The 5th and 18th NRA divisions attacked Donggu, forcing the Reds to withdraw while attacking the 5th NRA as they did so. The 2 NRA divisions entered the Donggu area, each on the opposite side of a ridgeline, unable to know what was going on with the other. On the 20th, the 18th NRA attacked Donggu with artillery, unknowingly firing upon their comrades, the 5th NRA, for half of the day. By the end of December, the NRA forces had taken most of the Jiangxi Soviet. However, the NRA forces' logistical lines were overextended, exposing them to constant guerrilla attacks. They had captured numerous towns, each requiring occupational forces, seeing only a third of their troops actually at the front lines. The communist efforts to gain support from the local populaces also saw them hindering the NRA's occupational forces. The local population was spying upon the NRA and provided the Reds with information about pending attacks against Longgang. 2 brigades of the NRA's 18th Division were going to attack Longgang on December the 30th. With this information, the Red Army countered by encircling the 2 brigades using mountainous terrain to mass fire and cut off any reinforcements. On the morning of the 30th, the NRA forces entered Longgang only to be surrounded. The 1st Red Army Corps attacked the 2 brigades, while the 4th Red Army and elements of the 3rd Red Army Corps blocked the 18th NRA's division's rear, preventing them from helping from Donggu. By the end of the day, the Reds had taken 9,000 prisoners, including the divisional commander, Zhang Huzan. Hearing word of the 18th Division's plight, Lu Zuping ordered a withdrawal of the forces to consolidate and reorganize. Tan Dao Yuan's 15th NRA Division advanced south towards Yuantou, and again the local population spied and fed the Reds intel, allowing them to quickly pursue him. On the morning of January the 3rd, the Red Army attacked the 15th NRA Division near Dongshao from 3 different directions. The NRA forces routed under the attack, many of the troops simply tossed their weapons and ran. Meanwhile, the 3rd Red Army was unable to fully encircle them, allowing many to escape. But nonetheless, they managed to capture 3,000 prisoners, 4,000 rifles, 40 machine guns, and a cache of ammunition. The defeats at Longgang and Dongshao effectively ended the first NRA encirclement campaign, providing the Reds with numerous recruits, a lot of equipment, and much experience. The destruction of multiple NRA divisions saw 15,000 prisoners, 12,000 weapons captured, and had validated Mao Zedong's strategies. The victory spread word of the Communist forces' strength in the region, and this began to swing the tide of public favor. The Red Army followed this up by executing Zhang Huzan, the commander of the 18th NRA Division. His head was sent to Jian to serve as a warning. From March to April, the Red Army held 4 different meetings to determine strategy going forward. During the first meeting on March 18th, many were calling for vacating the Soviet areas because of the NRA's numerical superiority. Yet no decision was made. The next meeting, a month later, the same argument was made, but others also advocated for staying and dividing into smaller units in order to conduct coordinated attacks to break the encirclement and destroy the enemy. But again, no decision was made. A third meeting occurred days later, and this time, acting on Mao Zedong's advice, the Red Army leadership invited different military units to participate. Dividing their forces gained traction, but now they were first asking to make a concentrated attack on the 19th NRA Route Army to establish a route out of the encirclement. Mao Zedong agreed to this idea, but argued it should be levied against the 5th Route Army, who were facing many issues at the time. The 5th Route Army were originally from northern China, thus unfamiliar with the territory. The meeting saw an agreement on attacking and then dividing, but no agreement on the target. The final meeting was held in late April, this time with Mao Zedong given the floor to present his perspective. He gave an impassioned speech, arguing that luring the enemy in deep made most sense for 2 reasons. Number 1, the Red Army and local populace had experience and resolve to defeat the enemy. And number 2, they knew the terrain. Mao Zedong outlined that they could sweep east across the Soviet, hitting the enemy from Fujian and Jiangning. Using this terrain, they would allow the Reds to isolate the NRA while providing mutual support and allowing them to use overwhelming firepower. Mao Zedong's speech won, and the strategy was finally approved. During the period between March and April, while the meetings were held, the Red Army began withdrawing troops from the fringes of the expanded Jiangxi Soviet. Beginning in March, the Red Army abandoned the newly acquired towns of Tubei, Dongshao, Longkou, Fujian, Tongjian, and Jiaoxi. By April the 23rd, the Red Army had relocated with the 3rd Army Corps based in Longgang. The 3rd and 4th Red Armies were stationed in the mountains between Donggu and Fujian, and the rest of the 1st Front Red Army was in the vicinity of Ningdu. As NRA forces slowly occupied Fujian, they began advancing east towards Donggu, up the Jikuan mountain range. The 4th Red Army, overlooking the road from Fujian and Donggu, prepared an ambush against them. On May the 11th, the 47th and 28th NRA divisions walked directly into the ambush. The Red forces initially rolled boulders from the mountaintops, causing casualties and confusion. The 2 NRA divisions were taken by complete surprise and began signaling for help, but the Red Army severed their wired communications. Because of the mountains and tree lines, aerial visibility was quite poor, neutralizing the NRA's air force capabilities. The 3rd Red Army descended the mountains and attacked the divisions fiercely. On the night of the 17th, the NRA forces had been defeated. 5,000 guns, 50 machine guns, 30 artillery pieces, and numerous supplies were captured. Meanwhile, the 43rd NRA Division, originally en route towards Tantou, received word of the defeat of Jiangdong, so they changed direction towards Shunan. They planned to ford the Xiaolong River near Shunan to consolidate their forces. However, local communist militia groups had taken the bridge, forcing the NRA to advance to Basha. On May the 19th, the Red Army defeated the 43rd NRA Division at Basha, seizing 4,000 weapons, 30 machine guns, and 2 artillery pieces. The NRA attempted to reinforce them with the 19th Route Army, but they were too late to the scene, and upon seeing the destruction, they pulled back to Jingou. These 2 defeats effectively destroyed the 5th NRA Route Army. Initially, the 26th NRA Route Army was ordered to occupy Nantuan, and then to advance east. However, once they occupied the city, their 27th Division received orders to reinforce the NRA position at Zhongchun, while the 25th Division remained at Nantuan. Before the 27th Division could advance, the 3rd Red Army Corps and the 4th Red Army attacked Zhongchun, decimating its defenders and occupying the city by May the 22nd. That night, the Red Army continued to Nantuan, where they destroyed the 25th Division. This caused the remaining NRA forces to retreat to Lian and Yihuang. The Red Army captured 3,000 weapons, 10 machine guns, and effectively eliminated the 26th NRA Route Army. Hearing of the destruction of the 26th and 5th Route Armies, the NRA began withdrawing back to Nanchang. The 5th Division was the last unit trying to depart Guangchang when it was attacked by the 3rd and 4th Red Armies on May the 27th. The 5th Division performed a fighting withdrawal to Nanfang, losing many in the process. Meanwhile, at Jianning in Fujian, the 4th Red Army was occupying Guangchang to try and consolidate their gains with a single division advancing north towards Nanfang. The 3rd Red Army Corps and the 12th Red Army advanced east, hunting down the NRA forces into Jianning by May the 30th. The attack caught the 56th NRA Division completely off guard. They had not yet been established. No defensive works were around. They routed as the Reds occupied Jianning, destroying an NRA regiment in the process. Along with the captured numerous war materials, the Red Army also got their hands on much-needed medical supplies. In the course of 2 weeks, the Reds had traveled over 300 kilometers, capturing 30,000 prisoners and captured 20,000 weapons. The newfound equipment was enough to outfit the entire First Front Red Army with all modern weaponry, while the older equipment was given to local militia groups. The Reds' success was due to good intelligence and mobility. The second encirclement campaign attempt by the NRA had caused the Soviet to grow nearly 5,000 square miles. In June, the First Front Red Army was still in western Fujian conducting operations. Initially, the Reds did not expect the NRA to initiate a third encirclement campaign so quickly after the last 2 failures. The Reds had planned a 3-phase expansion operating in the meantime. In the first phase, this would encompass political mobilization in Jianning, Tianning, and Luchuan. The second phase involved marching back into southern Jiangxi to consolidate strength in the rear area. The last phase would send the Red Army back to its original base, focusing on the western Gan River area to try and connect the Jiangxi Soviet with the Hunan Jiangxi Soviet. The Red Army were beginning to receive intelligence reports stating the NRA were beginning to move towards Jiangxi. In response to this, the Central Committee issued advice in June of 1931 to counter the new encirclement campaign. They basically just adopted Mao Zedong's strategy used in the first 2 campaigns. They argued it was essential to politically mobilize local populaces and support small guerrilla units to perform attacks on the NRA forces and prevent them from gaining a stable foothold in the area. They also advocated for the consolidation of the Soviets in the area, this being the Hunan-Hubei Anhui Soviet, the Hunan-Hubei Soviet, and the Northeast Jiangxi Soviet. The ultimate goal was to link them all up to form a red Hunan-Hubei Jiangxi area, and perhaps even establish communications with some other Soviets in the north. After sending the advice to the Central Committee, who was forced back underground as they came to unleash a suppression campaign in Shanghai, it would not be until August the 30th when the Central Committee re-established communications with the Soviets, but by this time the encirclement campaign was over. On June the 30th, the Red Army got to work preparing defenses. All local militias, Red Guards, and guerrilla units were activated to conduct delaying actions and defend localities from the NRA advance. The Red Army, roughly 30,000 men strong, pulled back inwards into the central base area in Jiangxi. This was a difficult task as many of them were spread far into western Fujian and southern Jiangxi at the time. After the 2 failed encirclement campaigns, Chiang Kai-shek had taken notice and he personally took over the 3rd campaign. With him came his own troops as he deployed the 5th and 6th NRA divisions into Jiangxi to attack the 1st and 3rd Red Army Corps. Chiang Kai-shek's entire force consisted of 2 army corps, with another in reserve and 1 garrison army. Altogether, they were about 130,000 strong. In late June, the NRA forces advanced into the Jiangxi Soviet. By the end of July, they had encircled the entire Jiangxi Soviet. Even with the encirclement campaign, the local populace continued to support the Red Army, providing supplies and food. On July the 31st, the Red Army conducted a daring breakthrough from Xiangguo, moving west to Wan'an before circling back to Fujian to hit the NRA's rear. The Red Army managed to escape the encirclement, but while heading to Fujian, the NRA discovered what they were doing, and they quickly reinforced the area and seized Xiangguo. On August the 3rd, the Red Army began occupying the areas near Guaoxing and Laoyingpan. The Red Army conducted a feint in the north using the 35th Red Army, 35th Division, 12th Red Army, and the 4th and 5th Independent Divisions to try and draw the NRA's attention west towards Wan'an. As the NRA advanced, the 1st Red Army Corps began attacking through Longgang and Hongpi. On August the 6th, the 47th NRA Division entered Liangtang, and the 54th NRA Division occupied Hongpi. With only the NRA Division occupying Liangtang, the Red Army took the advantage and isolated them and attacked. The 3rd, 4th, and 12th Red Armies attacked the lone NRA Division, routing it before continuing towards Hongpi to attack the 45th NRA Division there. The 45th Division's HQ was annihilated in the process, and by August the 7th, 2 NRA brigades had been destroyed. The 2 NRA divisions had suffered more than 1,000 casualties, with 3,500 men captured and 3,000 weapons and 14 artillery pieces lost. The Red Army then focused its attention against the 8th NRA Division in Hongpi. On the 11th, the 3rd Red Army distracted the forces in Longgang, with sporadic engagements trying to prevent them from reinforcing Hongpi. Meanwhile, the 4th and 12th Red Armies combated the 8th NRA Division, while the 3rd Red Army Corps and the 7th Red Division maneuvered east to cut off their escape route. Within the rainy and foggy weather, the Reds annihilated 4 brigades, resulting in more than 1,000 casualties, capture of 4,000 prisoners, 3,000 weapons, 11 artillery pieces, and a large ammunition cache. The victories also revealed the location of the main Red forces to the NRA. Chiang Kai-shek acted by deploying all of his forces to surround Hongpi's area, effectively encircling the Red Army. For over a month, the Red Army was completely under siege. Facing starvation and defeat, Mao Zedong and Zhou De hatched a bold plan to break out of the encirclement. They planned to split their forces, first by disguising the 12th Red Army as the bulk of their forces, having them advance northeast to attack Lu'an and Yuhang. The remainder would then move west and occupy Jingguo. On the night of August 16th, the 1st Front Red Army, minus the 12th Red Army, silently slipped through a 10-kilometer gap between the 1st and 2nd NRA Corps, heading towards Jingguo. As soon as the elements of the 12th Red Army began attacking Lu'an, Chiang Kai-shek pounced upon them, deploying the 10th NRA Division and the 1st and 2nd NRA Route Armies. For 2 weeks, the NRA chased the 12th Red Army up and down the mountain ranges. The NRA forces were exhausted and consumed a large part of their supplies, constantly attacked by guerrillas. In the meantime, the 1st and 3rd Red Army Corps arrived at Jingguo undetected, where they refitted and reorganized. By the end of August, the NRA realized that they had been duped. They found out that the main bulk of the Reds were actually at Jingguo. The NRA wheeled around to advance upon them, but just before they could, 2 Guangdong warlord factions rose up against the KMT, forming a rival government. Fearing an attack against Nanjing, Chiang Kai-shek temporarily lifted the encirclement campaign. As NRA forces pulled back, the Reds attempted to exploit the situation. On September the 7th, the 3rd Red Army and the 5th Independent Red Division attacked the 4th NRA Corps at Liaoyingpan, capturing 2,000 men, 2,000 weapons, and 10 artillery pieces. On the 13th, the 7th Red Army encircled the 4th NRA Corps at Fangshuiling's mountain range, while they were trying to retreat to Jian. In the process, the Reds destroyed the 52nd NRA Division and a brigade of the 9th NRA Division. With that, they captured 5,000 prisoners, 4,500 rifles, and 200 horses. These victories, however, would be overshadowed by a major defeat at Guaoxing. On that same day, the 4th Red Army and the 3rd Red Army Corps were coordinating an assault against the 1st NRA Corps. Based on rather poor intelligence, the Red Army misjudged their strength, resulting in a bloody stalemate. By the end of the encirclement campaign, the NRA had suffered greatly. The Reds had destroyed 17 NRA brigades, nearly 30,000 casualties. The Red losses were quite heavy as well, and compromised their position. Yet after these 3 failed encirclement campaigns, the Jiangxi Soviet stood at 50,000 square kilometers, encompassing 28 counties in Hunan, Jiangxi, and Fujian. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube and on major podcast platforms. Over on the YouTube channel, I just released a full documentary on an interview I did with Lieutenant Colonel Tom Williams and his time serving during the Vietnam War. You can also find that same episode in the form of a podcast. Now, I know I keep saying this, but I have a huge favor to ask. I recently opened up a YouTube membership, and it's identical to my Patreon account, found over at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. If you join either, you get access to the exclusive podcast with over 25 episodes and ongoing. You get early access to all the content I make, and you get voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. As you can imagine, it's actually quite hard to build a podcast audience on YouTube if you're not visually based all the time. I am gradually getting all of my podcasts to at least be over Zoom calls, so you can see my ugly mug and my co-host, with some light animations. But stating all of that, if you decide to join the YouTube membership, you will actually get a bit of a bonus because I have a lot of unlisted content over there. Hasn't seen the light of day. And for good reason, to be honest. Did a few wacky episodes after a few beers about things that border history and, to be honest, a lot of Godzilla stuff. So if you're interested in more comedy, I do suggest checking it out. Thus, the Reds had survived 3 brutal encirclement campaigns, even when Chiang Kai-shek took notice and personally directed his own forces to quell the Red Menace. They simply slipped through his hands. Mao Zedong's strategies were working and further boosting his standing amongst his comrades.